All right, I'd like to welcome you today to the Mackinder Forum. I'm Roger Baker, and I am pleased to welcome Jahara Frankie Matisek to the Mackinder Forum. He's a U.S. Air Force Command Pilot, Senior Fellow at the Payne Institute for Public Policy, visiting scholar at Northwestern University. He is the most published military officer serving, with 2 books, over 200 articles on the Arctic, defense industrial base strategy, and warfare. And Jahara has previously taught at the U.S. Air Force Academy and the U.S. Naval War College. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Jahara.
Thank you for that, Roger. Thanks for everyone for showing up today from around the world. Um, Everyone's able to see the screen. So, Arctic is becoming obviously a pretty big deal. Obviously, President Trump has, you know, sort of talked a lot about Greenland and sort of all these access points and sort of like the threat of not having the Arctic be secure. And this whole presentation, I think, is hopefully going to sort of bridge our gap in understanding on why it's actually it's way more important than we probably took for granted. And granted, during the Cold War, we obviously knew if there was going to be a war that uh, the bombers and ICBMs would all be going over the North Pole. But with that being said, because it is melting so fast, and the fact that China on multiple occasions has tried to sort of make inroads into the region, not to mention trying to buy infrastructure in Greenland. Uh, this is kind of like the revenge of a region that we always kind of took for granted, and now is it's kind of cliche to say, but it is basically heating up. So with that being said, um, so I'm gonna make the bigger argument here that the reason why the Arctic matters is because it's the seam between uh, the Atlantic, the Pacific, and obviously the high north of Europe. Uh, and once you start thinking along those terms, you start realizing that this is a seam and it's being exploited by adversaries of the U.S. And it's one of those areas that if you don't start investing now, when there is a crisis or conflict in this region, it's basically you're behind the curve. Uh, and why does this matter? It's because it is very difficult to operate in the Arctic. And I think at least that if we're going to start competing here, and people on this call are already probably cognizant of the fact that the U.S. is increasingly having to compete there, there's lots of little different things you have to do to actually be competitive and effective there. And it's more than just the icebreakers. And just to give you an example, like for example, the U.S. Army does have a dedicated sort of Arctic uh, warfare unit based up in Anchorage, Alaska. The problem is they're also that it's the 11th Arctic Angels. The problem is they're also required to maintain jungle warfare proficiency. And when you're trying to manage two qualifications, you're never really good at either. And so, uh, you know, I want to make the case here the fact that we have to do this. We have to take it as seriously as the Nordics do, and other countries that, again, uh, have realized that you can't just sort of check the box when it comes to like your Arctic uh, cold weather military capabilities. Because this is the Mackinder Forum, we obviously have to kind of go back in time to geopolitics and the revenge of it now, and the fact that what happens in the Arctic used to stay in the Arctic, and now everything is increasingly sort of reverberating through this scene. And so, just just because we used to ignore it and just thought everyone's going to be peaceful up there, and we all agreed to not be in competition in the region, that's basically changing, and it's accelerating because again, all the ice up there is melting. So when you think about sort of like Mackinder and Spykman, you have to sort of condition the reality that geography matters way more now, and because of technology, everything is increasingly becoming more compressed and making that seem even more important. So, for example, here, you think about like precision strike, space intelligence, undersea infrastructure, UAVs, the the importance of the routes in the air and maritime domain, but also sort of niche industry that you need to actually function and operate correctly in the Arctic. And to that point, that's the reason why the U.S. is actually buying icebreakers, not from inside the country, but from Finland now. Because again, when you sort of think about how do you function, how do you operate there, the U.S. is behind the power curve, and that's why we're having to buy icebreakers from the Finns. So again, when you think of this as a seam, you have to think about sort of like the geography, infrastructure, and what you can or can't do there. And so for when you think about your military capabilities there, a great example of not being able to function there as you should uh, for example, a few years ago, the U.S., the Brits, and the Nordics were basically doing uh, Arctic maritime exercises up there, and aircraft carriers within days basically became useless in the region because their flight decks iced over and there was no way to heat and de-ice the flight decks. And so aircraft carriers effectively become not useful and ineffective. And so that again forces you to reframe, how do we operate in a region that is very demanding and messes with your military? So again, thinking about the Arctic scene, thinking about all that ice is basically going away, and thinking about how new tech, sensors, uh, unmanned vehicles are going to make this area way more competitive in a way that just wasn't possible just a few years ago. The ice decline, all these new access routes, obviously countries are increasingly trying to claim things. If you remember back in 2007, 2008, the Russians actually planted a titanium Russian flag at the bottom of the North Pole, like to claim it for themselves. Again, very symbolic, but they've actually followed through on that symbolism in terms of the Russian military buildup in the Arctic. Uh, and if you guys notice over here, Svalbard is very interesting, sort of Arctic island because it is owned by Norway. But going back to an old World War I treaty, you cannot actually put any military forces on there. And that's going to be, again, one of these weird pressure points going forward as Russia increasingly militarizes the region, but also tries to do hybrid and gray zone activities in the region. And at some point, in my opinion, I do suspect that uh, that the Norwegians will likely have to throw that treaty in the trash because there's just so much going on up in the region, and there just isn't that much usable land for ports and infrastructure that you would need to actually militarily operate up there. Um, the other aspect, of course, of all of the drama behind the U.S. talking about Greenland is the fact that like the U.S. basically only has like its missile fields for shooting down ICBMs up here in Alaska, um, and because of that, you can really only shoot down missiles that are effectively coming from Northeast Asia. I suspect the Trump administration is likely leveraging and negotiating to have missile fields in Greenland so that you can then shoot down ICBMs that are effectively coming from mainland Russia and the high north of Europe. So again, and we can talk about in like the Q&A about that, but I think these are sort of interesting aspects to sort of think about in terms of why the U.S. is caring about the Arctic in a way that is, has in some cases sort of been off-putting to a lot of European allies. So in the case of Russia, Russia is doing a massive buildup in the Arctic. Obviously, you can see here they have a massive icebreaker fleet. They even have nuclear powered icebreakers, and the U.S. is pretty low. That's going to change, but it takes time and it takes money and it takes effort. Uh, the more important aspect that I think is usually missed is we keep thinking, yes, Russia is bogged down in Ukraine, and yet, even though they're bogged down in Ukraine, and it seems like the Russians are, losing, and they're having to, uh, throw a bunch of missiles and other weapon systems at Ukraine. At the same time, they have actually continued their military buildup of forces and units and infrastructure throughout the Arctic, despite the war in Ukraine. And I think that's a really important aspect to consider. Is when you look, like when you zoom out and you think, wow, the Russians are fighting a war in Ukraine and they seem to be throwing everything they have at it. But at the same time, they're not that exhausted because they're able to focus on the Arctic, and they're continuing to do things up there. And I think that's a really important aspect that, again, in the Q&A, we should probably talk about, because uh, it's a different narrative than what most of us have come to expect. For China, China at this point really seems to be looking at it from an economic perspective, because it is going to cut down a lot of transit times uh, going through the northern sea routes. The important aspect here, I believe at least, is it still looks very economic, but there is increasingly uh, certain amounts of military cooperation that's going on between China and Russia. It does not seem overly strategic at this point, but it does sort of lean in that direction. And the fact that China has declared itself a near Arctic power back in 2018 does lend credence to the fact that China wants to get into the Arctic game. And again, they're investing in icebreakers, they're investing in various sort of polar warfare capabilities. Not to mention that they're also doing a lot of things sort of dual use also in Antarctica as well. So I know we're not talking about Antarctica today, but there's a lot of sort of things you can do that if you can do it at the North Pole, you can do it at the South Pole. Um, and up there, you also see sort of like thinking about satellites and data. A thing that most people don't realize is that so much of American space power is actually dependent on sort of Arctic based uh, satellite infrastructure, because of just sort of orbital mechanics and what you need to do if you want to actually be a modern sort of uh, space power nation. You actually have to have sort of ground based satellite infrastructure around the Arctic Circle and also in the Antarctic Circle, just so that you can have as close as you can to real time space ISR and data, because of how satellites and orbits work. So again, that's something that we talk about in the Q&A about sort of the importance of sort of having infrastructure in the Arctic just to support like your satellites, but also the importance of thinking about in a future conflict. If I was an adversary, the first thing I would do, I would go after our space supporting infrastructure in the Antarctic Circle and also in the Arctic Circle. So that would mean Thule, which is now called Pacific, up in Greenland. That space base, in my opinion, would actually be a target, because it's not really that well defended, but also because it's a way to sort of blind the U.S. Because that's a part of sort of our missile defense architecture, but also sort of our space power infrastructure. So again, that's a really sort of important thing to think about as we kind of go forward about what's it going to take to be able to defend Greenland. And unfortunately, it is going to be effectively militarized. Um, Another important aspect is going back to 2024. That was the first time that the Chinese decided to get up into the Arctic, and they did basically joint military patrols with the Russians. Again, Symbolic, yes, but again, it sort of increasingly shows this is like the trend line. I've sort of already touched on this, but again, you have to think about sort of all of these weird choke points and routes for economic purposes, but also for military purposes. And even going back to 2018, uh, SecDef Mattis even called it the fourth ocean. And when we think about it in terms of military assets and resources, again, uh, it's sort of a region that no combatant command or service really wants to be a part of unless it's forced to, because nobody wants to dedicate the personnel or the resources or the assets to actually be, at least from a U.S. perspective, to be effective in the Arctic, because it's very expensive and it requires specialized equipment that you really can't use elsewhere. Just to give you an example, when I was hanging out with the Norwegian Navy, and we were talking about sort of like Indo-Pacific type of war games, they're like, oh, it's really difficult for our Navy to operate outside of Europe because we don't have air conditioning. And I was like, what? They're like, yeah, if we try to operate our ships anywhere outside of Europe, a lot of our stuff basically breaks down because we designed our Navy to function in the high north. So they have all the heaters they need. But if you try to deploy your average Norwegian ship out to the Philippines or Taiwan, it's not going to work because they don't have the air conditioning to keep the electronics, everything cool. So, it's little things like that you, in retrospective, you don't really think about, but then you start realizing, oh, yes, there are niche requirements for your weapon systems to function properly in the Arctic. So for a lot of the listeners here, if you weren't aware, things like jet fuel, it freezes at negative 47 Celsius. Diesel gelling occurs around negative 12 to negative 20 Celsius. Also, the same thing happens to LCD touchscreens by about negative 16 to 20. Again, your LCD touchscreen basically stopped working. There's lots of these little things. And again, you can winterize and do all this stuff, but now again, this makes things more expensive. It causes more maintenance and logistics issues. There are lots of compounding effects that occur when you try to function in the Arctic because it is just so unforgiving. Not to mention, again, the Q&A, we can get into what a polar day is versus a polar night, and just sort of all the sort of extremes you face just trying to function in the Arctic. So again, for the U.S., Alaska is sort of the jumping off point to the Arctic, but I would also contend Greenland's is going to become a part of this picture as well, just because of the scene and what I believe the current administration wants to do in terms of sort of defending North America. And of course, we all know this sort of is part of that bigger sort of golden dome concept, and these aspects of sort of missile defense and air warning and sort of all domain awareness. And so again, in the Q&A, I think this would be a really fantastic conversation to basically have. But I will say, on the other hand, because the U.S. is so far behind in this, I genuinely think the only way that the U.S. is going to be able to do this more effectively going forward have to lean on the countries that have been specializing in Arctic warfare for decades. So again, it's Norway, it's Finland, it's Sweden, it's Canada, it's Denmark. Even the Brits take it very seriously. From a U.S. perspective, about the only people that, from my point of view, I've seen take it kind of seriously is essentially the National Guard. There's a few National Guard units that essentially maintain Arctic warfighting capabilities and qualifications. But the problem is, at the same time, a lot of Arctic qualifications are treated like mountain warfighting qualifications, just because it's cold. It's not the same as actual Arctic warfighting. And again, we can talk about in the Q&A about like the nuanced type of differences. But unfortunately, a lot of times in U.S. military doctrine, they're treated as kind of the same thing, which is really unfortunate. And again, I hope that changes. Other important aspect is JFC Norfolk is a NATO command that is increasingly dedicated and focused on uh, Arctic military cooperation in NATO, but also Arctic military exercises, and again, uh, generating sort of a NATO military footprint for being effective and capable in the region. Again, the U.S. again is lagging, in my opinion, in this region. Um, and if we take this argument even further, I still think the U.S. needs to maintain at least a minimum amount of capabilities and expertise in this. But also, if you wanted to make sort of like the burden sharing type of argument, uh, if the U.S. was able to get more of NATO to take Arctic security way more seriously, this would actually free up assets, resources, and personnel for, again, what we think is the coming war with China in the future. So, uh, again, I think domain awareness is a hugely important aspect of Arctic, and there's lots of sort of sensor networks and sort of data collection capabilities that exist because of everything that's going up there. There's lots of resources up there, and again, that's a part of sort of well, how do you access it? Well, there's gonna have to be more infrastructure up there, and again, when you build infrastructure in the Arctic, it's way more expensive, way more complicated because again, you're dealing with tundra and other sorts of extremes, which again then drives you to the next aspect of like, okay, well, it needs to be defendable and survivable. How do you make this infrastructure in the region more resilient? And then when you kind of take it to its logical conclusion, all right, do we have a dedicated defense industrial base to be able to function in a way that can support sort of like the niche requirements for having basing, having infrastructure, and operating in the Arctic? Um, More importantly, is again, there are there are lots of opportunities for the Russians and Chinese to make inroads in the region. So again, you have to sort of go back to geography and think through how do we make like this region more defendable, and how do you think through logically sort of infrastructure, force posture, and essentially sort of shoring up all the seams of the region because they will be exploited. And again, I'm not saying we have to fully, have a bunch of bases up there, but you're going to have to find the right force mix in the Arctic of manned and unmanned capabilities, because the Russians have been so heavily militarizing the region, but also because it's going to become an economic choke point. So when we think through sort of like the bigger implications of this, again, we're going to have to invest more in trying to monitor it. We're going to have to harden the region. NATO is probably going to take a bigger part of the burden of the region. And then again, there's lots of weapon systems that have to be bought and invested in if you want to be capable enough and also to deter Russia and China in the region. Because unfortunately, when we say this is the return of geopolitics and competition, might makes right. And right now, Russia has, without a doubt, the best ability to operate in the Arctic. And that is one of those things that when Russia decides they want something, we're going to do something in the region, a U.S. and NATO response may be underwhelming because we have not prepared for this. And so that's kind of like my fair warning, is we have to think through this. Obviously, because I used to teach the Naval War College, had to throw a little love to Mahan about this. Again, what I think is important is everything that we're talking about is also applicable to what Admiral Mahan was saying back in the day in terms of like the importance of production and shipping, the territory and concentration of forces and choke point control. And so the Arctic is going to become the next sort of choke point in this new era of sort of great power competition. So as we think through this, I guess my parting shot for the audience here would be, how do we operate there better and do it in a way that makes sense, but also appropriately shares the burden, but also acknowledges like the risks and costs associated with inaction. And so with that, I hand the presentation back over to you, Roger.